Hello, public speakers. Welcome to Persuasive Speaking in the Public Speaking Online class. We've learned about informative speaking by now, and we recognize that informative speaking is important. We got to be able to educate people. Now, we have to be able to take the next step if we want to be good speakers, and there's going to be times when we're going to need to persuade people. We're going to have to make sales. We're going to have to convince that new client to come visit us, or maybe even persuade our parents, or persuade a company to invest in us. There's a lot of times when we're going to have to persuade people in a public speaking setting. In this lecture, you're going to learn the basics of persuasion. I teach a whole persuasion class, so I won't be able to fit everything from that class into here, but I'll at least give you some techniques that will help you make your eventual speeches persuasive. What is persuasion? Persuasion is the art of gaining fair and favorable consideration according to our own interests. So we're trying to gain fair and favorable consideration. And we want it towards our interests. Now notice this definition. We're not saying that you necessarily have to always change somebody's mind, per se. You don't have to convince somebody to move from viewpoint A to viewpoint B entirely. All you have to do is just make someone at least slightly more sympathetic to your viewpoint, whatever that is. So if we think of degrees of persuasion, and we have a little continuum here. On one end, we might have strongly opposed. So somebody's like, no, I don't like your idea at all. It's evil. Okay? But then you might have something in the middle, like moderately opposed. And maybe like they don't think that your idea is evil, but they're just like, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea. And then you have, perhaps, maybe just slightly opposed. You know, this could be a good idea. I really need to think about this, but I don't know. I have some worries. Okay, so slightly opposed. And then you have neutral, where you don't really have an opinion about either way. But then you might have slightly in favor, where they sort of think this might be a good idea. Then maybe moderately in favor. Yeah, that sounds good in general, and probably should do it. And then strongly in favor. Heck yeah, we got to do this. Heck yeah, I agree with you. Amen, brother. And then you start clapping and all that stuff, and you get standing ovation. Now, all you have to do in persuasion, you don't necessarily have to move people from, say, moderately opposed all the way to over here. All you have to do, let's say their starting point is here, all you're trying to do is just get them one over. If you can just move the needle just one over, moderately opposed to slightly opposed, it's a victory. Sure, they're still not doing what you want per se, but you've had some kind of impact on their beliefs. You've had some impact on how they think. You've opened their minds a little bit to your idea. And then maybe down the road, next time, you can try to move over neutral. The next time, maybe, and so forth. But maybe you won't get there. Maybe they just are so stuck in what they believe, they'll come over here, or maybe just come over here and stay here, stay at this little spot. But who knows? The idea then is you don't feel like you have to bite off more than you can chew. Don't feel like that you have to solve the world's problems in persuasion. You just got to move the needle a little bit. Just if you can even move it an inch, you're doing good. You're doing well. When you're analyzing an audience, there are three types of resistance that you have to be aware of, or really I would call them stances towards your beliefs. You have to think, where does my audience stand before I talk? How do they feel about what I'm about to say before I say it? This is part of audience analysis. You have to know your audience, and you have to know what are their common values that they're starting with, and how are you going to engage those common values? First, you have sympathetic audiences. And sympathetic audiences are ones who already agree with you. There'll be times when maybe you'll speak in front of sympathetic audiences, but you're not really persuading them per se because they already agree with you. Maybe what you might be doing is perhaps motivating them just to accept the ideas harder. So maybe you're moving them from slightly in favor to moderately in favor, perhaps. But the idea is that they generally already agree with you. A lot of times this is referred to as preaching to the choir, where you're already talking to people who you already agree with. So sometimes you're going to have an audience where you're going to have some people who are sympathetic to you and others who will have a different stance. So you try to figure out, how can I say something or get an idea across that will still speak to the sympathetic audience, but can also help move the opposing audiences as well? Second type of stance you might have is the apathetic audience. So you have sympathetic and apathetic. And these are people who are indifferent about the topic. They don't have an opinion either way, like they just haven't thought about it, or they don't know enough about it to form an opinion, or maybe they just don't care about it, okay? But generally, these are people who just don't have an opinion for some reason, either because of lack of knowledge, lack of willpower, just lack of interest. Now, when you have an apathetic audience, what you need to do is just get them to move from neutral to your side. So you have to figure out how to motivate them to care. You have to motivate them to care about your topic and also to agree. And then thirdly, you might have an antipathic audience. So antipathic audience means that they're opposed to your idea. These are people who are generally against what you're saying. Like they already have decided before, you're going to be speaking in front of the United Methodist Church and you're going to be giving a speech about why God isn't real. Okay, so you're probably going to be speaking to an antipathic audience. So you got to figure out how you're going to get this message across without losing them. So remember boredom, confusion, distraction, and offense? So somehow you're going to have to figure out how to convey your message and still get them to listen to you. Now, there are two general strategies that when people have to speak to antipathic audiences. One strategy I call is up the middle. I like to compare it to football, where, in football and rushing, you hand the ball off to the running back and they just run up the middle through the offensive and defensive line. Well, when you do an up the middle approach, you're basically addressing the points directly of whatever they believe and saying why they're wrong directly as well. So you're going to say, you all believe X. I'm going to explain to you why that's not the best way to think about it. And here's a better way to think about it. So you believe this, this, and this. Here's the problem with that. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so very up the middle type arguments that you're making. This can be effective. There can be times when up the middle is actually very effective, especially when you have power over the audience or you're seen as an authority and you can kind of say, you all have been misled. Let me explain to you how you can be better led. If you're not seen as an authority, though, it might be seen as more of an offense on that regard. So you do have another option, which is called around the barrier. So going back to the football analogy, when you hand off the ball to the running back, they can run up the middle. They can run up through the offensive line, or they can try to run to the outside. Maybe do a little jet sweep or what have you. Now, when you go around the barrier, what you're trying to do is you're trying to show how whatever it is that you're arguing is actually already consistent with the belief system that your audience already has. So let's say you're doing a speech about gun control, and let's say you're arguing for gun control, and the people that you're speaking to are ones who are all proud gun owners and such. Now, you could say, maybe perhaps, that we all believe in freedom. We believe in the Constitution and the First and the Second and the Third and every single amendment in the Constitution. We believe in freedom. Freedom is important. And nobody's going to probably oppose you for saying that. So one thing that's consistent with, having guns and being able to have these wonderful, pieces of machinery is that we respect freedom, not just to own them, but also respect people's freedom to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And by ensuring that everyone has some guarantee of that by making sure that certain people don't have guns, we're ensuring freedom for everybody, and then therefore we should pass gun control laws for mentally ill or whatever, okay? So you try to find some kind of value that they already believe, that an opposing group already believes, and you try to line up whatever you're suggesting with that particular value. Now, when you're dealing with an informative versus a persuasive, so this will help clarify the differences in case you're still a little bit unclear. Here are the differences between an informative and a persuasive. So as an informative, when you're a speaker, you're a teacher. Your job is just to give people information, to give them facts, to teach them something new, teach them a new skill, teach them about the history of something, teach them about how something works. And that's all you're doing. When you're doing a persuasive speech, you take on a different role. You're now an advocate for something. You're trying to get everyone to do something, to believe something. So you're going to have a position on something. You're going to have an angle or perspective on something. And you want people to adopt your perspective so that then they can do the thing that you want them to do, whatever that is. You're an advocate. A teacher might be unbiased and neutral. An advocate's going to be biased. An advocate's going to say, here's why you should do X, Y, and Z, and why the arguments for the other thing is wrong or not the way to go. When you're doing an informative, you think of your audience as students or learners. So you treat them like people who are acquiring a new skill. You answer their questions. You give them guidance so they can understand the thing that you're trying to show them. But when you're in a persuasive speech, your audience are more like agents. They are people who are capable of acting on something. If they're not capable of acting, then you shouldn't give the persuasive speech because this is going to be something over their heads. So the presumption is, whenever you're doing a persuasive speech, that your audience is capable of doing the thing that you're asking them to do. And therefore, they are agents. They are agents of action, agents of change, agents of whatever. Just, you want them, they are people who can do something. And the thing that you want them to do is something that they are capable of doing. Next, as far as the occasion goes, here you're offering information about something. Here, on persuasive, you're asking the audience to act. That's your goal. When you're giving a persuasive speech, the audience knows that you want them to do something. They're just trying to figure out what that thing is and whether there is compelling reason to do it. Finally, the tasks. In an informative speech, if I had to summarize informative speaking, providing information in an interesting way. That's the key to a good informative. You're telling us stuff in an interesting way by the use of your audience engagement techniques, by the use of your analogies and metaphors, the use of your props, the use of your energy, the use of your movement. You're making everything seem interesting, and you're making the topic, regardless of how mundane, just out there it is, you're going to make it interesting to this audience. You're going to build that bridge. Your task in a persuasive speech is compelling the audience to overcome resistance and to act. So you're asking them to do two things. You're asking them to overcome resistance that they have. You have to deal with resistance. One of the biggest differences between informed and persuasive is you have to address resistance somehow in a persuasive speech because there's going to be reasons why people don't act. One book even says that the way to think of persuasive is a conversation with their thoughts, with the audience's thoughts. You're having a conversation with everybody's thoughts in their head. And when people hear your arguments, they're going to have a thought. And the thought might be a resistant thought. So you got to be ready to address that thought. If you don't address that thought, they're going to keep on holding to that thought the whole time. And they're not going to be able to agree with the rest of your speech because they still have these lingering thoughts, these lingering doubts that people say. So you got to think, I'm conversing with your brain directly. And what might your brain say if I do this? What might your brain say if I do that? And you're trying to get your brain, the audience's brains, to be compelled to overcome the resistance, whatever's telling them no, to tell that thing to say yes, and then do what you want them to do. There are three types of persuasive speeches that we'll now talk about. There are fact, value, and advocacy speeches, and we'll talk about each of these. Fact speeches are speeches that are designed to establish the validity of past or present information. So you want to put something along the lines of validity of past or present information, or future predictions. So fact speeches argue validity about past, present information or future prediction, or past or present facts. Now, you're probably wondering, so how does that work? Well, here are a couple of examples of possible fact speeches that you might have. For example, cell phones don't cause cancer. So that's a present fact that you're going to argue. You're going to argue that cell phones do not cause cancer. If you want to do a future fact, automation will not cause a jobs crisis. That could be a future fact because you're saying in the future, this thing that everyone's afraid of isn't going to happen. Or if you want to do a past fact, cowboys, as they are portrayed in the media, never existed. So you're going to argue that basically cowboys, like your typical white male cowboy with a gun on a horse, those guys never really existed. Most cowboys were manual laborers and they were generally Hispanic and blah, 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 blah. Okay, all those things. So you want to argue that cowboys as they're portrayed never existed. All right? So those are fact speeches. If you're going to do a fact speech, you got to pick something. So if you're going to do something with fact, you got to pick something that's controversial. So this doesn't mean, I believe in free speech and all, but this doesn't mean you should do conspiracy theories and like United States never landed on the moon. I guess you can do that if, I respect free speech and all, but you don't need to do something crazy like that. Just find a fact that you think is controversial or where you think that there's going to be some kind of persuasive element to it. If you do gravity exists, well, like who's going to disagree with you on that? Or the world is round. I know there's a flat earth society, but nobody really questions that the world is round except for them. So if you're going to do a fact, make sure it's controversial. If it's too easy, if it's too obvious, if it's one of those things where it's just not a good topic overall, then that's going to affect how you're graded and such. So if you're going to go this route, make sure it's truly confidential. Truly controversial, not confidential. Next, you have value speeches. Value speeches address attitudes, beliefs, and values. Well, duh. Value speeches, if there's values. Okay. So when we talk about what a value is then, we're talking about how we should feel about a situation or how we should appraise something. Now, there are a lot of examples of what a value speech could be. You could do something like, soccer is better than football. In that case, when you have soccer v. football, you're going to argue that there's some set of criteria where soccer checks the box more than football does. So you'll have to establish what the criteria are. So, in criteria A, so if I were to line this up properly, so maybe you might go by popularity. So A is popularity, B is safety, and C is fun. And then you have soccer and then football. You're going to argue how soccer is better than football on that, soccer is better than football on that, and soccer is better than football on that. Okay, so you have to establish criteria. By what standard is soccer better than football? And you have to argue why your criteria are good criteria to go by. Because maybe somebody will say, well, sure, soccer, has popularity, it's safe, and it's fun, but football makes more money, football is more sophisticated, blah, 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 football has better athletes, blah, 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 fast-paced, blah, blah, blah. So then different criteria there, okay? So you got to keep that in mind if you're going to do a value speech. Another example, the right to privacy is more important than the right to national security. Okay, so you're arguing privacy versus national security. There's often times when those things conflict, as you might know with NSA and all those things. So which one is more important, a citizen's right to privacy or the government's need to create a secure country? You can even do something like why presenteeism is dangerous or why doing something is bad, okay? So value speeches, in those cases, when you define bad, you have to give us criteria of what does it mean to be bad, okay? So you have to define something is immoral, why is it immoral? What is immoral? What is morality? What makes something moral or not? So value speeches can be challenging because you have to think philosophically about everything you're saying. What does it mean when something is better? How do you measure better? How do you measure morality? How do you measure good and bad? You have to give us that measurement stick. And then you can tell us whether it's good or bad or not and why. Okay? So value speeches. Lastly, you have advocacy speeches. Advocacy speeches call for action. Okay? They call for a specific action. They generally encourage you to change your behavior either as individuals or as members of a group. You have to show that whatever it is that you want the people to do, you have to show that it'll solve and that it'll work. For example, there's a lot of possibilities here. The United States should pass universal health care. That's an advocacy speech. You're saying that the United States should pass universal health care, and that would be a good thing for everyone. You can also do something that's more personal. So like you can do like governmental action. You can do government action. You can do institutional action. Why ACC should begin a recycling program, perhaps. Or you can do personal action. I had a student who did why you should delete your social media. He did a whole speech on the pros and cons of social media, why we think social media is good, but actually it's actually bad for you, and why you should delete it now. And then he clinched on actually deleting his social media in front of everyone. He even showed his phone and such, so it was pretty cool. You can do that. Why you should shop local and not online. Okay, great. A lot of people want to shop on Amazon.com and free 2-day shipping and all that, and that's nice and all, but did you know that you're hurting our economy by doing that, and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. Shop local. Great. So if you're going to do advocacy speeches, we want things that where you're going to have to persuade people once again. So it shouldn't be why you should take a shower. Well, duh, everybody takes showers. Now, if you want to do why you should take less showers, save water, the planet, the effects on your skin, okay, that could be something. But we're just trying to avoid preaching to the choir here. Whatever you do your persuasive speech on, it needs to be something that's controversial, where you're going to have to actually persuade people, not just preach to the choir. There are 3 modes of persuasion that we're going to learn about. Now, I understand that as someone who's taught the persuasion class at a 4-year university, and maybe we'll teach it again here at ACC, that there are a lot of ways that we can understand and learn about persuasion. But for now, we'll start with the most basic and one of the most foundational viewpoints of persuasion, which is based on Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. So there are 3 modes of persuasion, and the best way to think about this is to think about it in terms of a triangle. So let's make a little triangle here. Now, the 3 modes of persuasion are, at the very top here, we'll have ethos, we'll have pathos, and logos. Now, here's the idea. Ethos refers to appeals to credibility. Now, we're going to go in depth here on each of these in a second, but for now, I just want to give you basic definitions. So ethos has to deal with appealing to your credibility. Logos has to deal with appealing to logic. And pathos has to deal with appealing to emotions or feelings. I was about to write feelings, and then I was like, I'll just write emotions instead. So, emotions. Okay? The easy way to remember, ethos, think like ethics, so credibility, character, and so forth. Logos, just think of logic, just L-O-G, logic, logos, arguments, reasoning. And then pathos, think of like pathological or pathology or pathetic or sympathetic. It's how you feel, it's your emotion, and that'll help you quite a bit. Now here's the idea. According to Aristotle, whenever we make arguments, we can make arguments that lean towards a logos style of arguing, where it's very heavy on logic and evidence and reasoning. Perhaps maybe at an academic conference, arguments are more logos heavy. But in some instances, we make arguments that have a leaning towards pathos style arguments, where they're very much focused on emotion and how we feel about something. Or we have arguments that are very ethos oriented. They're based on our authority or on our credibility or on the fact that we have research behind something. Now, it's not the case that we necessarily just pick one, but you kind of think of it as like one of those like heat map triangles, where like you might have an argument that's maybe sort of more in the middle between ethos and pathos, like they do a good job of incorporating both of those. Or maybe you have an argument that's very pathos and ethos oriented, so there's a lot of emotion oriented towards the argument, but there's still some ethos part of it. So you can have arguments that just vary in degrees within this triangle of combination. If you have an argument that uses all 3 pretty well, then maybe you have one that's smack dab in the middle, that has an ethos, logos, and pathos appeal all encompassed in the argument. Now, if you listen to like a very pathosy argument, you're going to notice that it very much appeals to emotion. So they may not put a lot of focus on the logos side of things. And that's okay because it's a very pathos style argument. So you know how to evaluate it properly. With ethos, you always got to have credibility. And so that's one of the things that Aristotle says. If you lose your ethos, you pretty much lose everything else. So you're always trying to protect your credibility no matter what. But whether you appeal to it directly in whatever persuasive attempt that you're making is a whole other issue. So you can use all three. And in fact, the best persuasion, I think, does all three. You do a good job of establishing credibility, using some logic, but also using some emotional appeals in there too, because humans aren't robots. We don't make decisions purely on logic. We also make decisions on emotion too. To explore these a little further, let's talk about ethos. So ethos refers to credibility. There's two aspects of credibility. There's competence and there's morality. Somebody can be very competent at doing a job, but they can also be very immoral. They could be like a sick human being or just do evil things while they're on the job, even though they're very competent. On the other hand, somebody could be very moral. They are very caring. They make very moral decisions. There's somebody whom you can trust. There's somebody who, you can trust with $1 million of cash and every single dollar would be there when you come back a week later. But the person might not be very competent. They might just be really bad at their job. Like they mean well, they're nice, they're moral, they make good decisions, but they just don't know how to do the job well. So competence and morality. Now here's the thing. Credibility is 100% perception by the audience. You might have done this yourself. You might have faked credibility before. You fake it till you make it, perhaps. Or you faked seeming like you knew what you're talking about. You knew nothing what you're talking about, but you knew how to fake the credibility and make it seem like you did, and the audience believed you. Credibility can be real, though. You earned your credibility, perhaps. Maybe there's a situation where you were just an expert on this topic, and it was piece of cake to convince people because you just knew so much about this topic, and that was earned credibility, maybe because of your education or because of your training or whatever thing that you did. Now, credibility is dynamic, which means that it can change over time. And in fact, we have periods of credibility. We have initial credibility, so we'll call it initial cred. This is credibility before you start speaking. Now, how do you establish initial credibility if you haven't talked? Well, often in public speaking situations, you're given an introduction, perhaps by a host of the event. And the host is going to boost your ethos a bunch by talking about your background, your your credentials, your training, and they're going to say, John was a graduate of the Stanford Business School. He worked in industry for 20 years and he's written several books. Okay, so all of that is ethos boost. So John is getting that initial credibility before he even talks. But also you can do reputation. Your reputation can be a form of initial credibility. If people know who you are and before you even talk, they know that you are awesome and you know what you're talking about and all those things, that's initial credibility. Then you have derived credibility. So derived credibility is credibility that you earn or you create when you present. So how do you get derived credibility? Well, citing sources, showing that you did your homework, talking about your credentials. So that's where an ethos appeal would work. Or appearing to know what you're talking about, using proper language and terminology. So if you're trying to give medical advice and you still refer to the gluteus maximus as your rear end, okay, that doesn't sound like you know what you're talking about. You're not using the proper language for that. So using proper language, using technical terminology. Also establishing common ground, showing that you know what your audience is going through, that you can understand where they're coming from because you've been there or you know somebody who's been there and you've found a way to build common ground. And then lastly, terminal credibility. Credibility that you have after the event is over, after the end of the speech. So, this is credibility that you just know if you have it, if you got your point across. And how do people feel about you after the end of the speech? If they like you more, if they applaud, that can help you establish the fact that you have terminal credibility. Following through on things that you said you were going to do in the speech, answering questions, your Q&A can help build your terminal credibility. So here's the idea. Credibility is dynamic. It can increase, it can decrease, or it can remain static, the same. You want to protect your credibility at all times. You want to establish it first, and then you want to protect it. And if you can, increase it. The next of Aristotle's 3 modes of persuasion is logos. Logos, of course, remember, is appeal to logic, evidence, reason. Now, to establish your logos in a speech and to make sure that you're hitting that department, if you will. A couple ways you can do that. Number one, of course, citing sources will help, and you're required to cite sources in your persuasive speeches, so this should be no problem. But showing that you did your homework, citing sources / showing you did your research, that helps establish credibility and your logos, right? Because if I'm evaluating arguments, I'm going to want evidence to support whatever it is that you're going to say. Citing sources does both of those things. It helps you make logos-style arguments, and it also establishes credibility. Next, you got to make sound arguments. Now, we're going to do a whole lecture on argumentation. Learn fallacies, learn argument structures. You're going to do that in the next lecture after this. So study Toolman, study the fallacies, make sure you don't commit those fallacies, and make arguments that are good. And then lastly, find consistency in the audience. Make your arguments consistent with their values. Make your arguments consistent with logic that they already hold. Find ways to match, to build the bridge between you and the audience. Your idea and the audience's ideas using what the audience already has. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Just know what your audience already has and find a way to take what they have and make it consistent with what you want them to do. Now, let me show you a technique that a lot of people use, or that I think a lot more people should use when you're persuading with large numbers. A lot of times people will do speeches that involve very large numbers. So let's say I'm doing my speech on smoking. So according to some statistics, 475,000 people die from smoking every year. Okay? 475,000. Now, I want you to take a moment. I want you to imagine 475,000 people in your head. So go ahead, do it. I want you to think of 475,000 people. I want you to think of 475,000 faces. Okay? 475,000. It can't be 3,000. It can't be 50,000. It can't be 100,000. It got to be 475,000 exactly. So if you have too many, you need to imagine less, okay? So do you have 475,000 human beings in your head right now that you can see and that you can imagine and you can name them all? Okay, probably not. Why? Because 475,000 is a really, 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 really big number. And our minds can't comprehend numbers like this, at least not at a deep enough level to appreciate it. So here's the idea. If you're going to talk about large numbers in a speech, sometimes what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to make these numbers more relatable and more meaningful to the audience. How do you do that? Well, there's 3 ways you can do that. First method is scale it down. So a number like 475,000 is too big. We can't imagine it. It's hard to think of 475,000. It's just too big. So break the number down into smaller numbers or rates to make it more comprehensible. So instead of 475,000 people die from smoking every year, how about that's 1,100 people per day, or 45 people per hour, or 1 person every 80 seconds. Now, can you imagine 1 person every 80 seconds? Can we count to 80 seconds right now if we wanted, and you could think of somebody just dying randomly at 80 seconds? Okay, that's much more meaningful to an audience. So you could say 475,000 people die from smoking, or 1 person dies of smoking every 80 seconds. By the time I finish this slide, 2 people will have died of smoking. Boom. Okay? So that's the first way, is you scale it down. Second way, you can do a numerical comparison. So you compare the number to a set of other well-known numbers, or you compare the event to another well-known event that has a high number that we're aware of. So you could say something like this. The number of Americans who die every year from smoking is more than the numbers of Americans who died in all of World War II. So smoking versus World War II casualties, smoking has more than World War II. Okay, so every year, we have a World War II every year, and it kills more people. Smoking kills more people every year than all the people who died in World War II. So basically, we're having something worse than World War II every year with people dying of smoking. Does that make sense? So that's another way, is you compare the event to another event that we know is bad or catastrophic or had a lot of deaths, and now we get it. Okay? And then what you could do is you could show a little chart, and then you could be like, smoking deaths, and World War II deaths. So if we were doing PowerPoint right now, that's what we would do. Now, thirdly, you can just do a visual comparison. Now, I usually give this little talk, by the way, when we do PowerPoint, but I'm going to give this now. You can help us visualize the number by using an object that we know represents that number. Now, for example, you could say that the number of people who die from smoking every year amounts to not just one Dallas Cowboys stadium filled with crowds, but it would amount to 8 Dallas Cowboys stadiums filled to the brim. Okay? So you do a visual comparison by showing 8 Cowboys stadiums. So if you can't visualize 475,000, just visualize a Cowboys stadium filled with fans to the brim. Now visualize 8 of those. Okay. So now you see how that can work. So in PowerPoint, if you had the visual aid, you would show the Cowboys stadium, and then you show 8 of them, and then it's really effective. So those are 3 ways. So if you're dealing with the speech in large numbers, just don't be throwing out 500 million people die, and then 600,000, 500, 400, and then it's just like lots of large numbers. I mean, it can sort of work for a second, but then if you really want to bring this home, if you really want me to really feel these numbers, you got to bring it down, because the human mind just can't comprehend. Lastly, we have pathos. So pathos are an appeal to emotions, to feelings, or the feels, if you will. Now, there's a lot we can say about emotions, and like I said, I spend like 3 weeks in my persuasion class talking about emotions and triggers and autonomic responses and all those things. But here's what we can know for now, just for this class. There are 6 basic universal emotions. So first you have anger. Anger tends to happen when there is some kind of interference with somebody's goals. So what triggers anger is interference with goals. So notice all the things that make you mad and make you angry. A lot of times it has to do with somebody getting in your way or somebody stopping you from getting something. Like there's some kind of interference going on, and it pisses me off. I'm trying to get home in traffic, and all those things. So that makes you angry. Next, sadness. This is experiencing an irrevocable loss. So that's usually a theme with sadness, is generally we lose something and that's why we're sad. Now, there is happy tears too, and we get that, but that's not making you sad per se. It's not like a depressive sad. It's kind of a different feeling. But definitely with sadness, there's some kind of irrevocable loss. With disgust, this is being close to something toxic or indigestible. So of course we could talk about eating rat intestines or something, and that's gross, that kind of thing. But we can be disgusted not just by objects or food, but by an idea. So maybe Nazism is disgusting, right? Because it's just so toxic, I remember watching this thing. It was a psychology documentary, and there was these experimenters, and there were these people in a room, these participants, and they passed around a hat, and it was a Nazi cap, and they said that it was worn by one of the officers in World War II. And at first, they didn't tell them it was worn by an officer. They said, here's a Nazi cap, and people were like, kind of holding it and they're kind of afraid to hold it. And then once he said, oh, but it was worn by somebody in World War II, like everybody just dropped it. It was like, that's gross, that kind of thing. So, that's discussed. Next, you have compassion. So this is being moved by another's suffering. So we feel compassion when we see somebody suffer and we feel bad for them. We feel like we got to do something. That's compassion. Happiness is all about making progress towards your goals. So we're happy when we're making progress toward our goals, whatever those are. We had a great day today when everything went smoothly. Nobody bothered us. We made progress. We got this thing done. I'm happy. I'm making progress. And then last, there's fear. Facing danger. That's concrete and imminent. That's fear. Now, why did I go through all these? We can't go into too much depth because of time and all that. But here's the idea. If you want to trigger a specific emotion in your audience, which you always want to, right? Remember when I said message plus effect when you're doing persuasion, when you're doing speeches in general? You want to find a message and you want to pick an effect, and you want to do those two things. That should be your goal. I want to get this message across, and I want to create this effect. I want people to believe X, and I want them to feel Y, okay? So if you want to convey anger, you got to emphasize the idea of interference with goals in your speech. So you should be talking about how something's interfering with our goals. It's stopping us from doing X, and it's getting in the way of Y, and it's going to continue to be a nuisance on us until we do something and act. If you want to do something sad, talk about loss. Talk about something that we've lost and how meaningful that loss was and how big that loss was and just how it's really hard to not have this thing anymore. Okay, so talk about loss. Disgust. Talk about something toxic or indigestible. You can fill in the blank there. Compassion. You got to show you have to show that people are suffering first. That's the first thing with compassion, is you got to show their suffering. So make suffering real. Make suffering inevitable. Not inevitable, but just make suffering real and close to home. And then you got to empower people. That's the other thing. You got to empower people to believe that they can act and that their actions are meaningful and will alleviate such suffering. Happiness. So talk about how we're moving forward, that we're reaching our goals, that everything is going great, and that you can continue to be great. Life is good. So emphasize this can make you happy. This can help you reach your goals, help you achieve your dreams. Motivational speakers are all about speaking towards achieving your dreams, achieving your goals. That's why people like them, because they make us happy. Motivational. Yes. Reach your dreams. Dream big. Okay, all that stuff. And then fear. Talk about a danger. Talk about this fear. There's this growing threat. And if we don't do something now, we're going to be hurting. People are going to die. This economy is going to go down the drain. We're going to be eating out of trash cans if we don't solve this problem. Okay, so there you go. There's your fear. Okay, so think of what triggers each emotion and then try to highlight that emotion in your speech by talking about it, referring to it. Speak to the triggers. I also want to talk about forceful language because I think this also speaks to pathos and also a little bit of logos. You want to use forceful language in persuasion. I think there's times when you want to be able to do that. There's 3 variables of forceful language, so we'll call 3 variables of force when you're talking about forceful language here. So first you have, what's going on? Okay, intensity. Intensity refers to the degree which your attitude deviates from neutrality. So this is language that deviates from neutrality. What do we mean by that? Well, a lot of times we try to stay objective and neutral. We try to say, for example, if we're trying to be just objective and neutral, you do not have high levels of intelligence, okay? That could be it. Or you do not display, you are an average thinker, or you are below average in terms of intelligence. Very just neutral, objective, that's cool. Compare that to you are shockingly and completely dumb. okay? So that is very forceful because you're like, it's shockingly, completely dumb, like in that, instead of like, you are not smart, like that kind of thing. So intensity refers to how intense are you saying something. So if you want your audience to get really involved in something, you want to use some intense language at some various points in your speech. If you're trying to exhort your audience to do X, Y, and Z, you're not going to do it with neutral language. You got to do it with some intense language in there. So notice, like, before a big game, you don't see team captains going, okay, we are going to score more points than the other team because then mathematically we will win. If we score more points than the other team, let's go. On 3, 1, 2, 3, score more points than the other team. No, that's not how it goes. They're like, we're going to kick the team's butt. We're going to take them, and we're going to play defense, and we're going to make a play every single time. I don't care. They're not going to get a blade of grass up in here. Okay, so there you go. So that's intense language right there. And they got intense emotion, and it's like they're not, okay, and then they're going, kick butt on 3, 1, all that stuff. Okay? So that's intensity. Vividness is your second variable. This is concrete imagery versus abstract imagery. Compare the two. The glass broke. Okay, so the glass broke would be very abstract, right? The glass broke. Okay, we get like a very abstract feel of that. Okay, so glass broke, something like that. Compare that to very concrete language. The glass came crashing down in a spiral and scattered pieces everywhere with a loud shattering noise. Okay, so that's very concrete. It tells a story of glass breaking, and it goes into very vivid detail about the glass breaking, you see? So compare that to the glass broke versus the glass came shattering down in spirals and scattered pieces everywhere with a loud shattering noise that created little crystals that dangled and blah, blah, blah. Okay, you see? Now, here's the idea. If you want your audience to see what you're saying, you can't speak in abstract language. You got to speak in vivid language. You got to think of yourself as sort of like a painter, and your tongue is the brush, and you're painting images inside your audience's brain, which is the canvas. And every little thing that you say, every little metaphor, and every little word that you say is a little brush stroke inside their canvas. And eventually you paint a pretty picture that gets presented inside their minds. And then they can admire that picture and see what it is and what it means. And they can see the beauty of your tongue and the way that you make words move and make ideas and images happen inside their brain. And they can appreciate you as a speaker and as an artist. You see how that works? Like the vividness of that? So do that with your speech. Be vivid. Paint pictures in our minds. Paint pictures with your words and be an artist. Okay. And lastly, I know this is very controversial, but we got to talk about it, at least mention it. Offensiveness. So offensiveness, of course, would be things like, profanity or, just political incorrectness, perhaps, would be another thing too. Now, here's the idea. Don't be offensive in your speeches, at least not for school by any means. Don't be offensive generally. But there's going to be exceptions to that. I remember watching a show, I think it was All or Nothing on Amazon, and it was one of the teams, and, the team was losing really bad. And so the football coach had to come in and he had to be a little offensive. And he was like, you guys are sucking it up. And, he wasn't super nice about it. And he was chewing them out. But it was for disciplinary reasons that he was doing that, right? And it kind of just lit a fire under people, right? So, of course, he wasn't neutral. He wasn't, trying to be nice. He was trying to light a fire under them. And so this is the way he did it. So, there's political gain sometimes to being offensiveness. I would say our current president has seen that being offensive does score him some points in some ways. But of course, it causes you to lose points with others too. So it's a very, very difficult game to play if you're going to use offensiveness, and you have to be really, really, really savvy. And it's not an easy thing to teach, and it's not something I really teach at all. I recognize that there is a place for it in some circumstances, but it's too hard to teach, and it's just, yeah. So I don't generally recommend it. Okay, so now that I've taught you some techniques here and just a little bit about persuasion, this is very basic level stuff that I've given you here. I know that we could go in a lot more depth in a lot of ways, but this will just get you going for now. Let's talk about some speech outlines so when you put your speech together, you know what you need to do. There are a couple different outlines that you can use, just depending on what fits your topic. One outline is the problem solution format. In this case, you are convincing listeners that there's a problem, and then you show the causes of it, and then you show the solution. So here's how it would look. You'd have your intro, and of course you'd have your tension getter, tie-in, thesis, preview. Now, there's different ideas or viewpoints on the intro, and this is true of regardless of which format you use, so I'm just going over this now because this was the first one. Some people have the school of thought that your thesis shouldn't give away your call to action right away because your call to action might shut off your audience before you even get there. So some people keep the thesis suspended. So they give a thesis, but it's a very suspenseful thesis. It might just be something like, instead of why you should go recycle, it might be something like, today we're going to discuss the impacts of garbage on the earth and what we can do about it. Okay, so then they'll get to the third point, which is the call to action, and then they'll express recycling. Versus today, I'm going to convince you why you should recycle. You see? So one way to think of it is like thesis as being the call to action, or thesis as being the general problem that you're addressing, and then the call to action will be secondary. Does that make sense? So there's different schools of thought on that. It just depends on what your call to action is, I would say. And do you think it will shut off your audience then? Or do you think your audience would be open-minded to your call of action early on, and then you can just build on why they should do the call to action? So that's going to vary just based on your audience. But in any case, you'll have main point 1, and then you'll have all the nice things in there, So you'll have a captivator, tie-in, thesis, support, and then transition, right? Then main point 2. Now, in the problem solution format, main point 1 would be the problem. So in main point 1, you're going to start your speech by talking about the problem. What is the problem that you're addressing? So if your problem is trash and how the earth is getting trashed, you should talk about statistics that say that the earth is getting trashed. You should talk about the impacts of the earth being trashed. Because the earth is being trashed, we're losing a lot of species and biodiversity is decreasing and our water supply is getting contaminated and all these, deforestation is speeding up global warming, so forth. So all of that is part of the problem. Your main point 2 would be the causes. So main point 2 is going to be about what's causing the problem. So why are we littering so much is the idea, or why is there so much trash all over the earth? So in main point 2, you're going to address those causes. So you'll give a captivator, and then you're going to give the tie-in, then you're going to give the thesis. What's the cause of this problem? So you're going to probably cite somebody according to so-and-so and so-and-so, on blah, 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 blah date or blah, blah, blah publication. One of the key causes of global pollution is, people not recycling. Okay, cool. So that's your cause. Main point 3 is going to be your solution. So in main point 3, this is where you bring up your call to action. So the only way to solve global pollution is we all need to start recycling. Okay, maybe that's your argument. So then you're going to say in main point 3, the solution. Now, regardless of what speech format you do, not only should you give the solution, but you got to give motivation to act. So you got to give people how to act. So what do? You need to recycle. Okay, well, how? Well, start by getting a recycling bin. How do I get a recycling bin? Oh, you go to blah, 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 blah. Okay, great. So give us the details on not just what to do, but how to do it, how we're able to do it, and motivate us that we can succeed, right? That our actions matter. That, okay, if I don't recycle, it's a big deal. Because I could always do the whole, yeah, I agree with you, I need to recycle, but, these other people, what's one person? Why does one person matter? Why do I care? Because everyone else is going to throw stuff away. You have to address these sorts of things. So just because you suggest a solution doesn't mean people are going to do it. Even if they logically agree with the solution, they need to be emotionally invested into the solution as well. And they need to feel like that they're going to be making a difference by doing your solution and that they're capable of making a difference by enacting your solution. So you have to be a motivational speaker in main point 3. And then lastly, you get to your conclusion. And of course, you always conclude with a summary, a thesis, a tie-in, and a clincher. Okay? So intros and conclusions really don't change much with persuasive speaking. But but problem, cause, solution. That's problem, cause, solution format. The next format that you can do is refutative format. In this case, you would have your intro, and you have all the staples of an intro. Main point one, there's a lot of ways you can do this. You can say arguments in favor of an idea. So in refutative format, you're basically running up the middle on an idea. So you're going to say, here are the arguments for, and then point 3, main point 2. Then you're going to talk about arguments against the idea. And then your fourth, or main point 3, will then be clash / solution / call to belief. So what you're going to do in main point 3 is you're going to clash the arguments and say why the arguments against are wrong, and then therefore why the argument that you're arguing in favor of should be true. Okay, so let's say I had a girl in a class do Marvel versus DC, and so she argued the arguments in favor of Marvel, and then she did the arguments against Marvel, or why DC is good, and then she did clash. She said, here's why Marvel is better than DC. Even though DC has X, Y, and Z, Marvel still has X, Y, and has A, B, and C. Even though DC is this, remember that Marvel can also do X, Y, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so she clashed. She clashed the arguments, and then she concluded, and she left with, here's why you should support Marvel instead of DC. Okay? Now, you can do this differently, too. You could also do categories. So you can do, instead of arguments in favor, arguments against, and clash, you could do categories. So we're going to compare them by, ticket sales, let's say, and then in terms of comic sales, and then do clash. So then first you talk about Marvel, then you talk about DC, then you talk about Marvel, then you talk about DC, and then clash is kind of like, here's why Marvel is better than DC, okay? Or whatever, okay? And I'm not necessarily endorsing your argument, I'm just saying, okay? All right. Lastly, you have the Monroes motivated sequence. Now, I didn't typically teach this until advanced public speaking. I taught advanced public speaking class, and they do motivational speeches in that class. You don't do a motivational speech in basic public speaking, but in advanced you do. Now, there's a whole sequence called the Monroes motivated sequence, and it has a whole outline to it. So first, there's the attention phase, where you just get the audience's attention. Then you establish credibility with yourself. You explain how you've been through a situation. And then you give a purpose. Today, I want to talk to you about how you can be better in your relationships, okay? Then you have a need statement. You talk about how the audience currently has a need. Have you ever just woken up and just realized that your life just isn't together the way you want it to be? Maybe you thought 10 years ago that you were going to be working a job making $100K a year, but you're waking up today only making 50. Okay, so you're addressing a need. Then you have satisfaction. Satisfaction tells us how to address the need. So maybe you're like, so what you need to do is not take more self-help classes, to go to a seminar, but I exhort you to look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, what do I appreciate today? What our world needs more than anything is gratitude. Saying thank you to people who we talk to on a daily basis. Saying thank you to the things in your house. Have you ever thanked the chair that you sit on, the beautiful lazy boy chair, or thank the wonderful house that you have, or the shelter that you live in? Have you ever just thanked the person who gives you coffee in the morning? The power of gratitude. Okay, so there you go. So you go into satisfaction. Now, visualization. In visualization, you ask the audience to visualize what the world would look like if they got this need satisfied. Imagine a world where everyone said thank you to everything, where every day, every small act mattered to somebody, and it was expressed through a sincere and heartfelt thank you. How much better would we all want to become? Because we would want to have that feeling knowing that we've made a difference every day, and that difference is acknowledged, no matter how big or how small, by people who we care about and interact with every day. Okay, so boom, visualization. Okay, so get people to close their eyes and imagine and think about this stuff. Okay, so visualize, okay? And then you end on a call to action. So I call you all to act, to thank people who you interact with on a daily basis. Thank your professors. Thank your classmates. Say thank you to whoever's in your life, because you never know when they might pass away. And you want them to know everything that they did for you mattered, because it does matter, you know? And then blah, blah, okay, however you want to clinch on that. Okay, so sorry, I'm just making this up as I go along. So pretty good for impromptu, but, you know, could be better. Okay, so that's Monroe's motivated sequence. So you have these 7 steps here. And then, of course, you can kind of fit it into the 5-point format if you want. So obviously, this is going to be intro. And then this is main point 1, main point 2, then main point 3. And then this is more or less in the conclusion, okay? All right. Speaking of conclusions, let's conclude this. Overall, when you're doing persuasive speaking, paint pictures with your words. Okay, that's number 1. Then if you have PowerPoint, show pictures with PowerPoint, you know? Show pictures, not text and slides. Show pictures with PowerPoint. That's also nice too. Okay, we'll talk about PowerPoint later. The other thing, I would say with persuasive speaking, find common ground. I think common ground is so important, and build off that common ground, I would say. Otherwise, pick a speech that's controversial, pick something that you can believe in, that you can speak forcefully about with great intensity, with great visualization, and put it in a good order that we can follow. And remember, emotions plus logic, okay? Message plus effect. That's what we want. Know your message, know your effect. Otherwise, I look forward to hearing your persuasive speeches.